All right, gentlemen, let's go ahead and take a look at who actually is working in the hallowed halls of Congress. Um, as we said in our last one, if you're going to have a Congress that has become more decentralized in power, meaning that there is less of a controlling figure or block, and it's kind of more of an every man or woman for themselves, it becomes important that we know who those men and women are. Now, if you look at the long scope of American history, Congress has been pretty waspy. It's been male waspy throughout her history. If you want to get your typical, and even today, if you want to draw a generalized sketch of a congressman or congresswoman, it would actually be a congressman. It is a middle-aged white Protestant who probably has a law background or a law degree. That is your typical congressperson. Now, if throughout the grand scope of American history, and even today to a large extent, the majority of Congress is male wasps, if they all voted as a male wasp should, let's say, as in they vote against anyone who's not a wasp, then that would all make sense. But they don't, obviously, because America is not a country of wasps, by wasps, and for wasps. And so the fact that while, if you took a class photo, if you will, of Congress, it would look like a lot of, 50-something-year-old, 60-something-year-old white guys who went to law school. They don't all vote the same. So we need to explore what is going on there and why. Now, I did say that, Congress over the long course of American history has been male and white and Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But it has gotten more diverse over time. It has been a slow but steady process. As your book mentioned, the 114th Congress, which is the Congress that met, it was sworn in January of 2015 and served through 15 and 16. That Congress had, as you can see, 25 of the 100 senators were not male or WASP. You had 20 women, 2 African American, and 3 Latinos. The Congress as a whole has slowly but surely gotten a little more diverse. Prior to 1992, there were no African Americans in the Senate, and there were only 2 women in the entire United States Senate. In 1992, you got a black woman named Carol Moseley Braun elected to the Senate, along with 3 other women. And so, it was a slow and steady transition. The House has been more apt to become more diverse than the Senate for several reasons. For one, the concept of the districts, which we're about to talk about. Secondly, the House of Representatives is up for election more often, and so there are more opportunities for turnover and change. One of the reasons for the growth in African American and Latino representation in Congress is the creation of what we call majority-minority districts. The idea is, in these districts, the majority of the population are actually ethnic or racial minorities of our country as a whole. And so the easiest way to kind of just say this is there is a congressional district, and 60% of the people of that district are African American. It is a district where the majority of the population is a racial minority. Now, these districts were designed to give minorities a better chance to elect candidates that would represent them. And they were actually part of these, they were a result in part of the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. Now, what that means is you are more likely to get a representative out of those districts who is, perhaps Latino, like the majority of the population, or African American. And that provides you what we call descriptive representation. What we mean by that is the official representing a district is representative of the generic description of the constituency. You know, oh, he is the African American congressman from the primarily African American district, something of that nature. Now, while that seems like a great way to give people a voice in government that is representative of their own voice, and to get someone in Congress who looks like them, there is a drawback to this. Descriptive representation looks nice, but now let's get back to the real issue, which is that congressperson actually going to get something done? So I'm going to go ahead and draw really quickly. So let's go ahead and just say we have a rectangular state, roughly rectangular state. Okay? Now, what we used to have, and let's say we have 6 districts in this state. We used to have this. Now, let's just say that the minority populations of this state could be roughly found, here, and there's a city over here that's, got a minority population. There's a small city down here that has a minority population, and there's obviously some suburbs and smaller towns. There you go. This is what we had before, right? District 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Obviously, the representative from District 6 doesn't care about minority issues, or at least doesn't talk about them on the campaign trail. They have no minorities. District 4, they might care, they might not. It doesn't look to be a big part of their constituency. Now, number 1 might care, depending on the year, right? This one's a toss-up. Number 2 probably cares. That looks like a lot of their district. Number 3, I think they're like number 4, probably not. And number 5, they might, right? It might matter to them in this situation, okay? Well, the problem, though, is that all of these congressmen are not going to be minorities, most likely, because in none of these districts are the minorities actually the bulk of the population. So what they did with the Voting Rights Act is they said, we're going to change the way this is done. So here is District 1, and here is District 2, here is District 3, here is, 4, and here's 5, and here's 6, right? And I apologize for all of this. But again, here's 1, here's 2, here's 3 over here. Actually, this is bad because of that, but you'll get the gist of it here in a second. What you've done now is you've created a district where obviously this person cares very much about minority issues. This person probably does too. But the rest of these congresspersons could care less. You went from having one congressperson who most definitely did, and a couple who might or whatever. And again, I apologize because this little enclave over here kind of threw my example for a loop. I could have drawn the district a little better there. What you do now is instead of having 2 or 3 congressmen who are at least going to take an interest in those minority issues when it comes election time or when they're actually at work, now you've made it to where there's only one congressperson who has to actually concern themselves with it. The other 5 could care less. They don't have minorities in their district. You basically took the diversity of their constituency and you stripped it away. So now you're going to have African Americans and other minorities in Congress, but they're not going to have any real power because there's only going to be a few of them, and they're not really going to be able to influence or sway other congresspersons because those other congresspersons don't have minorities in their districts. And so you give people descriptive representation, but not what we call substantive representation, meaning they actually get something done. Okay? The ability, as your book says, for citizens to have the policies that they favor enacted into law. You basically have created little niches for them, so to speak, where they can have their representative who goes to Congress and looks like them and has the same last name, etc. But they are unable to build effective political coalitions because you've basically removed them from the equation in most other elections. Now, which is preferable? Is it better to have a more diverse photograph of our Congress? Is it more desirable to have more minorities actually serving in the upper echelons of the government? Or should we aim to get a Congress that spreads the minority vote out so that it is not concentrated in any one district? So more and more people in Congress have to actually be concerned about it. Because as I'm about to tell you, some districts, you don't have to worry about your election. But there are other districts, it's a toss-up. And in those toss-up districts, you obviously have to fight for every vote. And you'll take every vote you can get in every constituency. At least you'll consider them. You'll take them seriously. You won't just disregard them. Now, it all depends, as I'm saying this, because for some people they like it. The districts are generally safe. The minority populations don't change, which means whoever is representing that minority group in that upcoming congressional election is most likely going to win. The outsider candidate, and again, let's just go with the African American district. Whoever is kind of running, representing the African American vote is pretty safe. Meanwhile, the WASP, who's going to challenge them, they don't really have a chance to win that election. And so some people in the minority community like them because they've created safe seats for them. Now you might ask yourself, why is that safety important? That safety leads to incumbency, being reelected, being there for long periods of time. Seniority is a real thing in Congress. The longer one is there, the more likely one is to get appointed a committee chairmanship or get onto the good committees or whatever. And that is one thing that African American and Latino members like. Because their districts are relatively safe, they tend to become senior leaders in Congress. In 1994, African Americans were in charge of 4 of the House committees, and Latinos chaired another 3. When the Democrats took control of Congress in 2007, after the 2006 midterm elections, African Americans, again, were put in charge of 5 committees, Latinos in charge of 2. And so it has become a way for minority groups to get a disproportionate amount of influence in the government, actually. Now we're going to go ahead and look at a couple of charts real quick, just to look at some of these trends, as I said. And I noticed, and there's no way for me to change this, that there is a typo here. For some reason, they favored the 112th Congress and listed it twice. But as you can see in the United States House of Representatives, you can see the number of African Americans and women basically ran side by side for quite some time. The 103rd Congress, if you're curious, was the Congress that served 1995 and 1996. So as you can see, in that midterm election, you had a sudden upswing of women. Actually, that wasn't a no, that was a midterm election. Excuse me, that was the Congress that was elected in the 1994 midterms. But you can see that there was a sudden upshot in the number of both women and African Americans elected to the United States Congress, House of Representatives, I should say. You see the number of Latinos also rose a little bit. That number has been rising a little slower than the others. Actually, you'll notice the one that really has risen is the number of women. African American and Latino representation has relatively flatlined. You have seen growth, but when you start to put that in perspective, that is over a 20-year span of American history. The number of African Americans has barely changed. and the number of Latinos has only grown by about 10 members. If you want to look at the Senate, again, fewer seats available, fewer elections, no diversity really to speak of until the mid-1990s, as we said, and suddenly you see a swing up in the number of women elected. Black and Latinos elected to the Congress is still, elected to the Senate, still low. But as I keep emphasizing, you only have a third of your Senate seats up for grabs any given year. So, there's not as much play. And as we shall see here in a moment, senators tend to have a little bit of an edge when it comes to incumbency. So that's another thing. You're not going to have a lot of turnover necessarily. One more graph I want to go to real quickly. Hang on, my mouse is not working. Just a couple little stats to break down. You can see the average age of a typical member of the House of Representatives in their 50s. This is basically comparing Congresses almost 25 years apart. The average age has increased a little bit, but still, not even 60 years old. You will notice that comparing the House and the United States Senate, you'll notice the number of lawyers is still high, over 200, but you'll notice that we're getting more business persons in the United States Congress. The number of military veterans has decreased. That is a function of several things. I would say that one issue, honestly, is there has been a lack of, a lot of people get out of the military and have been able to translate that into success in the business world. But our military has downsized. I know that we still have a very large and impressive military, but with the end of the Cold War and military drawdowns, we don't have as many people serving as we once did, and that means there are fewer general officers, et cetera, et cetera. Still, close to a fourth of the Congress are military veterans. And you can see incumbency. The number of congresspersons on their first term, a mere 44 in 1991, meaning that basically 390 of them had one re-election. You can see that the incumbency rate went down slightly, but still, the vast majority of Congress were incumbents who had successfully secured re-election. So, as you can see, you have slight variations in the statistics. We're seeing more business persons getting elected, fewer veterans, but incumbency and age have not changed dramatically. Speaking of incumbency, that is I'm going to call it relatively new phenomenon. And I say relatively because, I'm going to consider 50 years ago relatively recent. When you look at the history of a country that's, creeping up on 250 years old, that's relatively recent. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, most congressmen served one term. Most people went to Capitol Hill, fought for whatever they planned to fight for, and win or lose, most of them packed their bags and they went home after that term. Why did people only serve one term? Well, being a congressman back then wasn't a great gig, to be quite honest. For one, remember, this is prior to big federal government. There weren't as many programs, there weren't as many dollars, there weren't as many opportunities to kick things back to your state. There just wasn't as much being done. So being a congressman did not seem like a really cool, powerful job or a very lucrative position. Traveling to D.C. was difficult. The back and forth was not the easiest. When Congress is not in session, what are you going to do? Just hang around D.C.? I realize some of you find D.C. to be quite the enjoyable city. Go back 100 some odd years, D.C. was just a hot, humid mess in the summers. It was not a very nice town to be in. D.C. of the 1800s was pretty squalid for a capital of such a large nation such as ours. So it's not like, you were hanging out in your cool Georgetown condo every evening having parties. It just wasn't a fun life. And being a congressman didn't pay well. They did not get the six-figure salary that they get nowadays. Also, districts were very competitive, and the two parties were relatively equally balanced. There weren't a whole lot of quote-unquote safe districts back then. That changed, though. By the 1950s, serving in Congress was now a kind of lifetime thing. You get the career politician, or as it says up here, the professional politician. Between 1863 and 1869, the number of first-termers in the House, or rookies, fell from 58% to 8%. In 1969, when they swore in that new Congress, in that January, only 8% were new to the job. Now, there are several reasons for that, obviously. Increased pay, more programs, more opportunities, more influence. D.C. became a fun place to live, all that stuff. But it became a place where basically once people got elected there, they stayed there for life. I do want to point out that there was talk of term limits as people began to note that people were going to Capitol Hill and basically staying there until they were collecting Social Security. And then some, people began to talk about term limits. There has never been a successful move for term limits. In 1995, the House approved a constitutional amendment, but the Senate was able to kill it, so it never went on to the states for a vote. The Supreme Court also struck down an effort by a state that was trying to impose term limits on its own congressmen. So a specific state tried to put a limit on their congressional terms, but the Supreme Court said that a state cannot put term limits on the federal government. Now, one of the things that did occur was there was a wave of change. Some of you might be aware that in 1994, the Republicans upset the Democrats and took control of the House of Representatives. This was when Newt Gingrich came to the forefront of American politics, if you guys are familiar with his name. Yes, the Republicans took control of the House for the first time since 1952. The Democrats had 40 consecutive years of majority in the House of Representatives. Well, when you suddenly see all these Republicans win congressional seats that they hadn't won for decades, you're obviously going to get some fresh faces. And we've had several back and forth elections like that. Your book mentioned in 2012, 75 new members came to the House. 58 new ones were elected in November of 2014. And in the 114th Congress, which was elected in the 2014 election, half of all the members were either elected in 2010 or later. So while you had some incumbents, many of them were only on their second or at most third term serving. So you had a lot of fresher faces in Congress. But let's not kid ourselves. Having 50 or 60 new members elected in a body of 435 still represents a 70 plus 80% incumbency rate. And why is that the case? Well, it's the case for several reasons. But your issue comes down to these districts, and there are two types of districts that your book talked about. There are marginal districts, and there are safe districts. If you look, and we have a chart that we're going to look at here in a moment. Let's just go ahead and go to the chart. If you look at the over the span of American history, so between 1964 and 2014. Okay, so we're going to look at elections over a 50-year period of American history. And I would like to know why they made a graph that provides over 100%. Clearly, whoever made these graphs doesn't know how graphs should work. But anyhow, if you look at that, the average re-election rate for House incumbents, the average, is in the 90%. Your book says it actually comes out to 93%. And for the Senate, incumbency rate of re-election stands at 82%. So over 5 decades of American history, the House is over 90% re-election rate, and the Senate is over 80%. And as you can see, 1978 was the only time with the Senate incumbency re-election rate dipped down to 60%. And you can see here, House re-election rates have never gone below 80% in those 50 years. So even in these years where we talk about these big shifts or changes, it's really not that big. Now, going back to these districts I was talking about. Okay? One definition of a marginal district, and it's the one we will use because it's the one that your book is using. A marginal district is a district in which candidates are elected to the House and win with 55%, with less than 55% of the vote. So the margin of victory is less than 10%, if you think about it. Because if you won 54% of the vote, it means that your opponent probably got somewhere around 45% of the vote. So if you get less than 55% of the vote, you're in a marginal district, as it is called. If you win by more than 55% of the vote, you are in what is called a safe district. If you use this definition in 2012, 18% of House seats were marginal. That means that 18% of the House of Representatives won their re-election bid by less than a 55% vote. You take that into consideration. That is impressive. But let's take it a step further. Let's say that in order to be in a safe district, you have to have 60% of the vote or more. Even if you took it to that level, where you said, I want to see you win with 60% of the vote or more, you still have over half the seats in Congress would be considered safe. Over half of Congress gets elected and wins by 60% or more. Since the 1970s, more than 60% of House members have been elected with at least 60% of the vote. Now, the Senate, under half of all Senate incumbents won re-election by such a wide margin. It's harder for Senate seats to be safer because it's the whole state. There's no way to tailor things for your district. There's no way to gerrymander your district. For those who aren't familiar, that is a term that refers to tweaking the boundaries of your district to bring in certain constituencies or cut out certain constituencies. You're running for the whole state. And so it's a much harder game to play. It's kind of like running for president. You kind of have to try and win everybody over at once. It's difficult. Being a member of the House, you have a smaller territory to work with. You have better defined constituencies and interests, so it's easier. So senators have a tougher time. Now, the question we have to ask is, why have the seats in Congress become far less marginal? Why have they become safer? Well, it is not a simple answer, and there are many potential answers. Okay? For one, and it's something we will be able to talk more about if we get to elections in this class, but the incumbent has a lot of advantages in resources. For one, incumbents usually have an advantage when it comes to fundraising. They have the built-in name power, so to speak, name recognition. They've been out there. They've been on TV. They've been interviewed, potentially. It's not guaranteed. But they have gotten some free press, potentially. And so they're already there. They've got the name recognition. They've already got some allies. They've already got some fundraising help, probably. They do have the ability to send mailings to their district free of charge, the franking privilege, which means it's cheaper for them to campaign. Um, I know some might say, isn't that like a campaign violation? You don't actually have to send an advertisement. Just send a survey. Send anything and send it to your district and make sure your name's on it. Again, it's free advertising if you think about it. I get it all the time in the mail. I get something from, Congressman Massey, and it just, it puts in the back of your head, oh yeah, that's the guy in Congress. The opponent has to pay for every one of those mailings. Incumbents also, they travel more frequently because they have free travel. Your tax dollars pay for that. So they are able to travel about a little more easily and a little less expensively, on their dime at least, which makes them, able to campaign more. And they are able to get stuff done in Congress. The challenger makes promises. The challenger talks about what they will do or what they plan to do. The person who's currently in Congress can point to what they did do. Now, obviously, this is where, getting your name attached to a bill or having the right votes, on your record are critical. But there's the potential that you can say, I got the contract to get that bridge built. I brought those jobs home. I saved that factory. You actually did it. And so that is another built-in advantage for incumbents. I will say, too, if you think about it, incumbents, because they have the built-in advantage that I just said of their office, the resources, the name recognition, travel, etc. If you want to see a large number of incumbents get swept away, I honestly don't know how you expect that to occur. The deck is already in their favor. If you want to see incumbency rates drop dramatically, something would have to change dramatically, because the current system basically makes it their election to lose. That's why the House of Representatives has a over 90% reelection rate. Now, as I said, there is no one answer to it all. I think I think they all add up. Your book gave several, little examples of there are upsets. Eric Cantor, who was the House Majority Leader, he lost in the primary, actually, to an economics professor, and that's rare. That is not very common, and to lose in a primary, no less. So it's not to say that Cinderella stories and upsets don't occur, but you're basically expecting the underdog to win the majority of the time in congressional elections, if you want to overturn the tradition of incumbency or the trend of incumbency. And so I don't think that's going to happen. Now, I mentioned the Democrats controlling Congress. Between 1933 and 2015, Congress the House was generally more controlled by the Democrats. The Democrats, there were 42 Congresses in this time period, because there's an election every 2 years for a new Congress. So in this time period, there were 42 Congresses. Democrats controlled both houses in 27 of those 42, and at least one house in 31 of them. And as I said, that's in part because they controlled the House of Representatives from 1952 until 1944, or 1994, excuse me. So right there, they had 21 straight years, or straight Congresses of House control. So in this span of American history of roughly 80 years, the Democrats were in control of Congress more often than not. Since 1994, the Republicans have been in power more often than the Democrats. The Democrats took control of the House in 2006 and held on it to 2010. The House, though, was retaken by the Republicans in 2000 and in the 2010 election, and they held on to it up until the most recent election, the 2018 midterms. why did the House go from basically a guaranteed win for the Democrats and suddenly become a bit of a back and forth game? What changed? Um, a key reason is that the Democratic Party that controlled the House was not a truly ideologically united party. Throughout much of the 20th century, the Democratic Party was really two groups that were just working together. I'm not going to say because they didn't know what else to do, but because they always had. You see, you had Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Northern Democrats tended to be more liberal. Southern Democrats tended to be more conservative. And so they didn't exactly agree on many things, but they came from the same party and they formed a powerful voting bloc, and that helped them become a majority of Congress for decades. I used to joke with people in college 20 years ago, and I knew people who were Democrats in our state, and I did not understand how or why. Well, I understood why. They were Democrats because their grandpa had been a Democrat and their great-grandpa before that. And that's just what they did, and that's what they've been taught. And they were pro-life, they were pro-Second Amendment, they were pro-death penalty, they were pro a lot of things that I don't think West Coast Democrats would necessarily be okay with. And that is an example of that Southern Democrat, in a way. It's the person from the South who, on a lot of things, they are against gay marriage, they are against abortion, things of that nature. But they hold on to that Democratic label because it's the label they always had, and they weren't quite ready to jump to the other side. Well, that all started to change. That all began to break apart and change. Now, I do want to mention, though, throughout a long part of Congress's history, when the Democrats were dominating the House, that part of the Democratic Party would, when it suited their fancy, they would break ranks with the liberal Northern Democrats, and they would form what is kind of called the conservative coalition, where basically you would find Southern Democrats who would vote along with Republicans in the House or the Senate on certain topics. And the only real opposition they faced was the Northern Democrats, who by themselves did not number enough to prevent them. And so that is, this was like the swing vote in the 60s and the 70s, when you had bipartisan stuff getting passed. What was really happening is conservative Democrats in the South were joining forces with the conservatives in the Republican Party to pass certain pieces of legislation. And again, those Democrats were called Democrats, but if you look at many of their beliefs, they were more in line with the Republican Party of the time than with the Democratic Party of the time. Now, since the 1980s, and especially since 1994, this conservative coalition has not been very important. And I would argue it even goes back into the mid-'70s, in my opinion, and that is because the topic that we had discussed in our class several times, what happened was the South realigned. They did not realign in their views. They simply realigned in party affiliation. You had Southerners who, for decades, had voted Democrat, and they suddenly realized that wasn't their party anymore. That, the party of, Franklin Roosevelt or whoever it was no longer the party that they currently saw, and they weren't going to vote for it. They were pro-gun. They were pro-life. They were religious. They were a lot of things that the Democratic Party no longer stood for, and so they switched over to the Republican Party. If you look at presidential elections, honestly, since Richard Nixon in 1972, when Richard Nixon annihilated, oh, my mind fails me now. Oh, he was from South Dakota. What was his name? Oh, George McGovern. If you look at presidential elections since 1972, when Nixon took everything, basically, the only time that Democrats win states in the South is when it's a Southerner. 1976 with Jimmy Carter. Actually, the only things Jimmy Carter really won in 1980 were Southern states. Well, I shouldn't say the only things, but he won a large chunk of the South. Ronald Reagan took everything under the sun in 1984. Bill Clinton, he was able to pull a few Southern states in 1992 and in 1996. But then if you look at the other ones, it tends to be the Republicans win the Electoral College down south. And if you start to look at the makeup of the United States Senate, and I think that is actually more important in considering this than looking at the actual House of Representatives, you get more and more Republican senators from the South. So what really happened is there was just a shift in voting loyalty or party loyalty. Now, one other thing I do want to talk about and mention that you will find or see within Congress, and it's something I've talked about several times on and off. Congress has become more ideologically partisan. You are not going to find a person that calls themselves a liberal Republican, and you're not going to find someone who calls themselves a conservative Democrat. Things that were said and done 40 years ago are just not going to happen anymore. I think I've brought it up in our class several times. The Democratic Speaker of the House during the Reagan years, Tip O'Neill, he always was seen having cordial lunches with Ronald Reagan. Yes, Ronald Reagan, Mr. Conservative. He had friendly lunches with the Democrat majority leader of the House. We've all seen the interactions of Ms. Pelosi and Mr. Trump, and it's less than cordial. So it's become kind of you've got to be ideologically pure at this point to have the support of the Republican or Democratic Party. You have to draw hard lines. And so that is another change that has come in the last 20 or 30 years. Now, we started out this discussion, and let's go ahead and back up. We started out this discussion talking about how Congress was a bunch of wasps, right? Generally speaking. So if Congress is a bunch of wasps, but they don't all vote like a bunch of wasps, what is going on? What is at play? And one thing that people need to realize is when they go to vote, there are different ways that you can approach this and look at it and make this decision. If Congress is a truly decentralized system where individual politicians are making decisions for themselves and for their district, okay, we have three basic ways that we can interpret their decision or how they come about it, okay? There's the representational view or the representational approach, which is based on the concept that basically members want to get reelected, and therefore they will do what it takes to get reelected. They will vote the way their constituents want them to vote, the home district, okay? They are truly going in there and just reflecting what the people back home want. And we're going to talk more about each one of these in 1 second. The organizational view is the idea or the belief that since actually most people don't know what's going on, the average voter is ill-informed, doesn't know, and I don't want to make that sound like the average American is dumb or doesn't care. There's a lot happening on Capitol Hill that we aren't aware of. We don't know what the votes are. We don't know what the bills are. And so for most of the day-to-day operation for a congressman, your home district isn't going to know it. No one's going to talk about it. And in this model, the idea is the legislature, or the legislator, I should say, is basically going to do what they need to do to please party leadership, fellow members of Congress, quid pro quo, if you will. The idea of I'm going to go along and get along to please people so it benefits me down the road, to get a favor in my pocket, something along that line. The last approach is the attitudinal view, or the last interpretation, the attitudinal view. Members of Congress basically go in there and they vote how they believe. They actually vote what they believe, because when you do the whole cost-benefit analysis, the pro-con, however you want to say it, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? And so some people believe that congressmen go in there and they just vote how they want to vote, based on what they understand and believe things. Now, let's look at each one in a little more detail. There are some times where you are in Congress and there's something coming up and it's a hot topic, and it's going to be covered. And there are going to be reporters swarming all over the steps of Capitol Hill asking questions, and this is going to be remembered. That might be the time where you need to take this approach. That might be the moment where you need to just bite your lip, and even if you don't necessarily agree with it, vote the way your constituents want, even if you don't agree with it. Gun control, abortion, something of that nature. One way that you can, by the way, get a feel for this is polls, surveys, some of those phone calls that we immediately hang up on when they say, I'm calling from so-and-so's office with a survey. There are ways to try and get a feel on the pulse of your district. I would say that the clear limit is, it's got to be something people care about. It's got to be a hot topic. If it's just minutia, if it's some little thing no one's going to hear about, no one's going to talk about, no one's going to know about, you can't get a clear read on how you should vote. It's got to be one of those key decisive issues. When public opinion is strong and clear, yeah, you can respond to it. And there is a lot of research that tends to back up the idea that that's how members of Congress respond in those situations. Again, impeachment. There was all sorts of talk about some of these senators who were from states that voted for Donald Trump in 2016. They were coming up for re-election, in 2020. And there was this whole idea of, are these Democratic senators going to break with their party and maybe even break with their conscience and do what the people of their state want, which is support the president they voted for, right? That would be a great example of the representational view, if that's in fact what they did. I do want to mention, again, when we say this too, constituents is a tough term to define, because it might not be all the people in your district. It might just be there's that group in your district that you need for that next election. Let's say it's something involving the airport. That might not be a real important topic to everybody in northern Kentucky, but there is a select group of people who are going to care very much about that airport and what happens to it, and if it gets proper funding and this and that and the other. That is a constituency. It's not everyone in your group, but that might be one of those things where, Congressman Massey says, I've got to do this to keep these people in my good graces. All right, so organizational view. The idea of I am going to kind of go with the flow. I'm going to follow the lead of maybe my party. I'll just do what the party whip tells me to do, or what the speaker tells me to do, etc. Or maybe just if I'm a junior congressman, I ask one of the older fellows that I respect or that is kind of mentoring me or whatever. Remember, the speaker or the majority leader, whoever, can't punish me for breaking ranks. So it's not like they can force me to do it, but they can give me strong cues and encouragement. I do want to point out too, and we'll get to it more when we get to committees, and this is probably going to shock some people. Congressmen are very ill-informed a lot of times when they go to vote. They miss meetings all the time, and not because they're lazy, but because they're overscheduled. No one has enough time to read everything, to be properly briefed all the time. Sometimes you literally have to ask the guy next to you, because that's about as good as you blindly voting, right? I'm sure we know people who they'll say, I don't know enough to vote, so I don't vote. I'm not informed, so I'm not going to make that vote. I guess as a congressman, you could do that, but if you abstain too much, then that's ammunition that your opponent's going to use against you in the next election by saying you went to Capitol Hill and you've done nothing. So you might, let's say, it's something involving the military, and you don't really know anything about it. You really are poorly informed, but you have a friend who serves on the Senate Armed Forces Committee who helped draft the bill. Hey, on your way over, I mean, it's a 3-minute conversation. It doesn't take long. Ask them, what should I do? What and why? Okay, thanks, man. And do the vote. It's like asking for answers on the quiz before you walk into class. It's not exactly the most great way to do business and to run an organization, but I'm pretty sure that there are some congressmen who just look at the guy next to them and do exactly what they do. Now, there's the other idea that congressmen do what they want to do, the attitudinal view. This shouldn't be surprising, right? These people ran to serve in government, and generally it's because they have some strongly held beliefs and convictions. Nobody gets to Congress just by luck. And the idea that these people who have these strongly held, oftentimes decades-long developed beliefs and ideas, that they would just roll in there and blindly follow the crowd or just kowtow to the masses does seem a little off. So it shouldn't be shocking that at times these people are going to vote their conscience. Now, we've been talking about polarization on and off and on and off and on and off. We've talked about the shift of the Southern Democrats to become conservatives. Most Americans, unlike members of Congress, though, are relatively moderate. If you remember back to the very start of this course, I showed you some surveys, particularly of young Americans, but in general. Most Americans define themselves as moderate. Even those who define themselves as conservative or liberal define themselves as slightly either way. I'd say a good half of America lies near the middle of the spectrum. They don't have clearly cut defined visions or beliefs, at least not strongly held ones. And so if you're a congressman, while the people in general tend to like middle of the road and compromise and everybody wins, you got elected to Congress because you made promises. You made promises to certain groups. There's a party that you have to kind of stand behind, at least most of the time. And you can't just kind of go with the flow. You've got to keep in mind the promises that you made in the election, the party that you represent. But on the same token, they can't punish you. What if it isn't a hot topic? What if it is just kind of some blah thing, and the people don't care? What do you do? That might be the moment where you just say, I'm going to vote my conscience. I'm going to do what I want. It has become harder to do that in an era where breaking ranks with the party can kill you in the media, let's say. Also, you have to realize, if the average American is very moderate, that's when special interest groups become everything. These groups that, who honestly have become very powerful with the advent of all of our media and technology, social media in particular. It used to be pretty difficult to really get a message out there and influence politics. Now it's really easy. All it takes is a couple of good tweets, a couple of good videos, and you are now influencing policy, or at least votes. You're shaking up elections. And so you have to realize as a congressman, those special interest groups who not only can make or break an election, but oftentimes have a lot of fundraising potential. Those are groups that you have to keep in mind as well. So there are limits to the attitudinal view. I think that again, on the major issues, you are less likely to see this than either of the other two. Because this is the one where that it'll get you in trouble with all sorts of folks down the road, so to speak. So we have spoken about party and special interest and things of that nature. We will actually look at the structure of the Congress, the role of the political parties and things of that nature in our next video.